If you have been writing JavaScript for any amount of time, you have likely used promises yourself. Promise in JavaScript allows developers to write asynchronous code more cleanly. It wasn't too long ago when the concept of promise didn't even exist in JavaScript. Back then, the only option for developers was to rely on events and callbacks. But that resulted in code that was difficult to follow and error-prone. While we are using promises and writing asynchronous code, it is easy to forget that JavaScript is still single-threaded. Let's see this in practice. Here you will see that promises take sequential time, whereas web workers are truly simultaneous. Before we move on, it is important to distinguish between the two types of promises, native and custom. When I say native, I mean promises returned by the browser APIs, like fetch, file API, and such. When I talk about custom promises, I mean promises that you write on your own and do some manual work in it. This is the type of promises I'm going to be talking about more specifically. The main thing to understand is that even if you use promises, the work done in them will be executed on the main thread. And JavaScript being single-threaded means that the main thread will be blocked while the code you ran in the promise is being executed. This is not a problem with native APIs though, that return promises, because browsers run their code in a different thread and it does not block the main thread. The solution is to use web workers. Web workers allows us to run code in threads other than the main. Like having multiple threads is like having a multiple lane highway where not all cars have to go through the same lane, and you can take some cars onto a different lane. By the way, one misconception is that number of threads is limited by the number of CPU cores. That is simply not true. Even in a CPU with just one core, you can have multiple threads. However, for best performance, having one thread per core is ideal. But this is not something we need to worry about or have control over in the browser. Hopefully now you have better understanding of how promises and workers compare to each other. Promises aren't a free pass to ignore the performance-related implications of your code. If you ever have trouble remembering this, just remember this simple rule. If your code is CPU intensive, run it in a web worker.